Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in around 2 minutes. We're going to try to give a couple more attendees a chance to join in, but thank you for being here. We'll start soon. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. If anyone could just send me a quick chat or message just to make sure that you can hear us just fine, that would be great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth year of our ICBE Spring Webinar Series. We thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you're all staying well and staying healthy. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Carlos Rivers, and I'm the Operations Research Analyst for the Institute of Competency-Based Education at A&M Commerce. And my role has largely focused around data collection and analysis of CBE programs on our campus and throughout the state. And so I am really excited today because today you're going to hear from Jessica Mason and Kelle Parsons from the American Institute for Research, who are going to be sharing their findings from the 2019 survey of post-secondary competency-based education. Courtney, who's here to help us as well from the Institute, has already uploaded the full study in the handout section, just in case you want to dig deeper and or share with your colleagues around your institution. I have had the privilege working with both of them in the past, and so I'm thankful to both of them for sharing their wealth of knowledge about CBE with us. So without further ado, I will pass the presenter ball to Jessica and Kelle, who will introduce themselves and take it from here.
All right, thank you, Carlos. Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. As Carlos was saying, we'll be sharing findings from the 2019 National Survey of Post-Secondary Competency-Based Education. And just for a quick introduction, so I'm Jessica Mason, a researcher at AIR, and I'm joined by Kelle. Do you want to say hi, Kelle?
Hello, everyone.
So looking forward to talking to you all today. So without further ado, let's jump in. So we want to share our findings today from this survey. So the survey's goal kind of overall is to better understand the landscape of CBE interest, adoption, and perceptions. Essentially, we're trying to take the pulse, so to speak, of the field. So in 2019, the second administration of this survey, we had 602 institutions responding for about an 18% response rate. And with that in mind, just framing up the rest of our discussion for today, We will share our key overall takeaways from the 2019 survey, and then we will dig a little bit deeper, getting into findings and insights that we think might be especially relevant for folks who are in the planning stages or considering implementing a CBE program, and of course, answer your questions. So please feel free to add questions to the question box throughout. We'll monitor, and we might pause from time to time to open the line for you to elaborate and discuss. And we'll pause throughout. And it's not mentioned here on the slide, but just noting that this is being recorded today. So we wanted to kick this off with just a little exercise to get to know you all. So Kelly is going to launch polls here for us. We are wondering whether you have CBE at your institution and your role on campus. So if everyone could complete the poll, we can get a sense of who's here with us today. Right, so we have some responses coming in. It looks like so far about 70% of you have a CBE program and the rest don't, but are interested or planning to do so. So hopefully we'll have some good takeaways for all of you. Now I'm seeing some responses coming in for everyone's role on campus, and it looks like we have a great mix of folks. So representation from provost office, deans, faculty, and quite a few people who are saying something other than these roles that we selected. So thank you all for being here, and I'm glad to see, just kind of a sampling of different folks, and be interested to hear, as we go through your questions and how this resonates with you in your different roles. All right, so with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some of the main takeaways. So this year in our analyses, 3 key themes emerged. First, we observed slow but steady growth in CBE. We also saw that institutions reported the continued presence of barriers to CBE implementation and scaling on campus, both internal and external to the institution. And finally, despite those persistent barriers, there remains a great deal of optimism about CBE's future growth potential. So we'll look in a little more detail about that in the next few slides. So let's look a little bit more at what we mean by slow but steady growth. So you'll see here in 2018, we had 57 institutions reporting a total of 512 CBE programs. And this year, those numbers increased to 64 institutions reporting a total of 588 programs. And then the charts you have on the right show just a little bit more detail on CBE adoption in 2019. So the top chart, you'll see the breakdown of undergraduate and graduate programs. There were 492 undergraduate programs and 96 grad programs. And then the bottom chart breaks down institutions' CBE adoption status. So we see 64 institutions who had adopted CBE programs in orange. Then the light gray is showing 309 institutions reporting in progress adoption. In dark gray, we see 136 institutions reporting interest in CBE, but no program yet. And then the dark blue represents the 93 institutions that reported having no interest in CBE. The next major theme that we observed was the continued presence of barriers to CBE adoption. So again, these are both internal and external to the institution. Some of the most common barriers that we see, and they're listed here on the slide, are including federal student aid regulations and processes, other competing priority initiatives on campus, program startup costs, institutional business systems and processes, and for those who had not yet adopted CBE, on-campus expertise for developing CBE programs or lack thereof. So the chart here, which I know is a lot of visual for a slide, is showing barriers and facilitators for those institutions with CBE programs or in the process of adopting. but the picture looks similar across stages of adoption and interest. We think it's also interesting to note that institutions often selected the don't know response option. So this could suggest they're neutral on the topic, they didn't know what the text referred to, or maybe they just hadn't encountered that issue yet in their work. And thinking about how we can maybe mitigate some of these barriers, we also could take a look at the facilitators on the opposite end. So factors most commonly reported to have helped implementation are things like the ability to align competencies to industry standards, senior administrators' perceptions of fit and support of leadership, and also evidence about student outcomes. So some of the things that can be helpful for folks. And then again, despite those barriers, we see institutions consistently reporting continued optimism about CBE's future growth potential. So overall, 76% of the institutions that responded to the survey believed that CBE would grow in the next 5 years nationally. 22% thought it would stay the same, and just 2% were expecting negative growth. And when we break this out by institution type or CBE adoption status, the same pattern largely holds true, as you can see on those bar charts on the right. So even for those with no interest in CBE, nearly half of them still expected it to grow nationally in the next 5 years. And then looking within institutions, we see kind of a similar pattern. So we asked institutions about CBE's growth potential at their own institutions, and 61% reported they expect the number of CBE institutions at their institution to increase in the next 5 years, and 37% thought that the number of programs would stay the same. And this could suggest that they consider their institution maybe to be at scale in terms of the number of CBE programs to be built, but something to just be thinking about and explore further. So that is kind of the 10,000 foot view of our key takeaways and those big themes. We can pause and see if there are any questions in the question box yet. Looks like maybe not quite yet. Yes, and we can make those slides available. I'm seeing a few more, but my chat box isn't working very well.
I think the question I see is, did the first slide read that 602 schools responded? And yes, yes, that is what it said. And then I don't remember when that got asked, but if you were asking that when we said 57 institutions and I think 64 institutions had CBE programs, the space between 64 and 602 is other folks who maybe in the process of adopting but don't yet have a program, or are interested but haven't even started, or have no interest in adopting. So that's the breakdown. I did just see a question about how many schools were 2-year institutions. That is a great question. We left it out today for this, but that is in our report. So this is a good opportunity to point you to the handouts again. So if you take a look at the handouts tab on your GoToWebinar, if you click I think it's the second one. Yep, the second one there. You can find the breakdown of our respondents on page 7. But I can answer, since I just did that, about 30% of our respondents were 2-year institutions and 70% were 4-year. Oh, I do see another question already. At the university level, are the occupation-oriented programs more positive about CBE? That's a good question. I think we'll touch a bit more on that in a few minutes, but I'm going to come back to that in the discussion at the end, if that's all right. Okay. I don't see any other questions, Jessica.
No, I don't see any coming in either. So Kelly, I will turn it over to you to dig a little deeper on some of those additional questions that might be particularly interesting for those kind of earlier on in the process of adopting CBE.
Perfect, yes. And I will be, so I know we have about 30% of you reported that you don't have a CBE program at your institution. I know some of you might not be at institutions, so I'm not sure how you answered that. And about 70% of you do have CBE. So I'll also be interested to hear whether you think this resonates with your experience. So don't limit yourself to only questions in the question box. Please feel free to say that resonates, or we think, that you see that in a survey, but we think it might be different at our program or something. So please feel free to engage with the questions box. We want this part to be somewhat discussion-y, if you're up for that today. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. All right. So in no particular order, I would say, we tried to pull out some key topics that we think might be worth discussing further, that we found interesting and might be useful to you. So that's sort of what I'll walk through briefly. So first, understanding motivations, or why people said that they were interested in CBE or why they adopted it, because of course that could be used for many things, but it's also potentially useful for internally making the case, right? What does the institution say was the reason they did this, therefore might be useful to other institutions who are thinking about using CBE for similar reasons. So the top two, you can see that there was, people generally agreed with a lot, although lowering tuition was not a particularly common motivation. But the top three were expanding access for quote unquote non-traditional, or sometimes referred to as sort of today's students, responding to workforce needs, of course, was another one, the ability to align to the workforce, and desire to improve learning outcomes kind of more broadly, right? I think more aligned with sort of a quality conversation, right, is the improving learning outcomes. So that's sort of big picture, what people said most commonly, but you can see the other options here, and that for the most part, there were several relatively highly rated, and so you can definitely, I should have mentioned, all these charts come directly from our report. You can also, as you like, you can click into that and explore a bit more about each of these charts. All right, so beyond just the motivations, you might have noticed on the slide that Jessica showed earlier, we had barriers to CBE adoption, but this chart has both orange and blue on it. We actually asked people what hindered and we had them rate whether some particular factor hindered or helped their progress. And so we often talk about the barriers, but we thought it was worth pausing on what people said actually helped their progress. So we think that's also relevant to others who might be starting down that path or still in the middle of their adoption path. So the top of the list here was senior administrators' perceptions of fit or support of leadership for a CBE program. Of course, we can imagine a number of reasons why that was so helpful. As Jessica said earlier, program startup costs and other things likely require leadership support to get it moving internally. So that certainly makes sense. Ability to align industry standards to programs' competencies. I think in some ways that sort of echoes what we saw earlier about aligning to workforce needs. So being able to use external standards to say, well, even in a traditional world, we're aligning to this. How about we build a program that is CBE, potentially also a facilitator? And then that might actually touch on a bit of the question someone asked about occupation-oriented programs. This doesn't necessarily say that those programs are more positive about CBE, but I think it does indicate that external industry standards can sometimes help. And evidence about cost and outcomes is another one. So I think as researchers, that one surprised us because we said there's, so far there's not there's not massive piles of evidence out there, but I do think there are some really compelling institutional cases, right? And I know ICBE and Carlos presents a lot on Texas A&M Commerce's example. So I think there's a lot of really good examples that kind of get held up and maybe what folks are citing here. I see a question over here. To get more information on roles, you might add a choice for administrative director or dean. Oh, yep, that's a good point. Thank you. I think we were limited to 5 roles on this, so we collapsed too much, perhaps. I see 2 other questions. What about the ability to align with national certification examinations? That's a good question. We did not specifically ask about national certification examinations. We sort of broadly asked about industry standards. That's probably a good thing for follow-up. We try not to add too many options because people will close out of our survey, but that's a really good one that we should perhaps explore and kind of qualitative follow-up with some of the folks that do have CBE. Okay, and someone asked, are you able to give examples of where industry standards align with program competencies? I think some good examples, although Carlos and Jessica, please feel free to chime in here. I think we see, and we'll show in a couple slides, that we see a lot of nursing programs, for instance, where there's licensure and there's there's standards set by an external body. I suppose it may not always be industry per se, it might be state boards, right? So we see that in nursing. We sometimes see that in computer science, for instance. So I don't know if those are the level of examples you're looking for, but those are a couple of examples. Okay.
Yeah, so y'all, if you email me afterwards, I can, depending on, what type of program you're hoping to create, I can get you in touch with different institutions that might already be using industry standards for program competencies. But yes, we see that as a use case with CBE, and there's institutions doing just that.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So, I forgot about the last bullet over here. So back to factors that help CBE adoption, demand for employers, which I think is potentially related to the industry standards. And then finally, that on-campus expertise for developing CBE programs. Jessica called that out earlier as something that was listed as a barrier only for those who hadn't gone through the process of creating a CBE program. For those who had created a CBE program, they said that was a huge facilitator. So that makes sense, right? It helps people get over the hump where they might have developed that internally. All right, let's see here. Okay, so planning steps. So last year we asked folks, do you have a program? Are you in the planning stages? Are you interested or are you not interested? Those are roughly the categories we used, and a lot of people said planning stages, but we didn't ask any follow-up questions. So this year, I should say, in 2018, that was what we did. So in 2019, what we did is ask a bit more about what steps they had specifically taken. So I know some of you already have programs. I'd be interested in seeing if you have a theory on the order here, but no single sequence emerged. It's not the case that everyone went kind of in the order that these are listed, or sort of the from bottom to top order that these are listed, but some steps certainly were more common than others. So developing competencies and developing assessments were the top two typically overall, and then engaging employers or external partners in developing or articulating the competencies. That's a little bit of overlap with the previous one. And then engaging stakeholders
Kelle,
within the institution. Yep, go ahead.
I actually think there's one missing here. How about market research, right? Identifying those needs in your local marketplaces that could be good fit for CBE specific industry. So I would add that one to the list.
That's a good point. Yes, market research, or sort of so I think both market, your nearby market, and learning about CBE more broadly is something that we didn't include in these steps, but we know, for instance, that some people start by going to a conference and trying to figure out what is this CBE thing, right, first. So yes, agree. We probably skipped a few basic steps. Okay, so we also saw engaging stakeholders within the institution to assess readiness. So we know, it takes a lot from the bursar, from financial aid, from institutional research and the registrar to stand up a program that is kind of fundamentally different on some key operational points. And this is a good moment to say that a lot of the steps that were included here were based on CBEN's quality framework. So if you want to learn more about kind of what's included in some of these steps, I think that's a really good resource. All right, so adoption patterns. So we were also very curious about whether there was kind of a path to CBE that was consistent across institutions, or even that occurs in some places. So we didn't just say do you have a CBE program, and then only ask about CBE programs. We asked about a number of different elements that are associated with CBE, that both those that meet the definition of CBE for the purposes of the study, and a few that are sometimes kind of traveling nearby or useful to CBE, but don't necessarily make a CBE program. So some of the ones that we do think of as core to CBE, some amount of flexible pacing, program completion is based on mastering all competencies, things like that. That's sort of the top half of the list with the white background on the chart. Things that were not considered, meeting the CBE threshold were things like, simply defining competencies at the program level, right? Lots of folks do that for accreditation already, but that doesn't necessarily mean CBE. PLA is another good example of something that's, certainly kind of related and could feed. You start with PLA and then you build CBE, or you start thinking about CBE, but you end up doing PLA. So we looked at both of those. Of course, perhaps not surprisingly, we saw more activity among the elements that didn't meet the bar of CBE, but were still somewhat related. So we're continuing to look and explore that. And one thing we saw in sort of the 2018 to 2019, we think, is perhaps there's a hint, we certainly need to follow up on this, that some CBE programs start with certain elements but add others later. So maybe you start with program completion based on mastering all, et cetera, but you don't necessarily incorporate flexible pacing from the beginning. You build, you get all your systems in place to allow for that over time. So we're not sure about that one yet. That's just something where we sort of share as something we're going to continue to monitor. So beyond that, we did take a look at, we asked folks about the students enrolling in their CBE programs. And this one comes with a bit of a caveat that we knew that the folks responding to our survey may not have this information sitting right at their fingertips at that moment. And so we didn't want them to click out of the survey because we thought they might never come back. So we gave people the option of don't know, and indeed don't know was one of the most common answers, or was the most common, I think, in all of them. So, but generally, of those who knew CBE student populations, generally they said we're similar on demographic characteristics on most elements, except for they were more likely to have prior credit and more likely to be over 25. So they weren't more likely to be veterans at the institutions that responded, and weren't more likely to have fewer white students, but they were more likely to be older and have prior credit. So this kind of broadly aligns with other work about CBE, so isn't super surprising, but I think is useful to kind of keep monitoring, right? Especially since CBE is often talked about as a way to expand access, or as we said at the beginning, serve quote unquote non-traditional populations. It's good to sort of check in always on whether or not it's indeed doing that. All right, so a bit more that we kind of dug into was delivery mode. So we wanted to understand, it's sometimes folks think, oh, CBE, that's also online, but that's not necessarily the case, as many of you on this call probably know. So 37% said we're entirely online, our CBE programs are entirely online. The rest were some kind of combination of hybrid, blended, and face-to-face formats, and there were some that are face-to-face. Those I think we think are more, they are more likely to be the kinds of more occupationally oriented programs, potentially like welding, for instance, right? There's lots of in-person components of that. So that's just a bit on delivery mode. Next, we asked a little bit about price point and price structure. So in our first year, we asked about just the price point, but we want to add a huge caveat about the structure and individual pace. So we asked folks if CBE was less expensive, about the same, or more expensive as compared to their traditional programs. 56% said they cost about the same to the student as traditional programs. So this is, I should be clear, this is cost to the student, not cost to the institution to run it. the 56% said about the same, 39% said less expensive. Of course, our caveat is that if an institution has a subscription pricing model in particular, by design, that will vary by student, right? So they might be designed to be slightly less expensive if you complete in kind of equivalent to traditional time. But if you end up taking longer, you can pay more in a subscription. You can, as a student, pay more in a subscription model. So I think a key thing to look for, and I'll be really interested, if you have a CBE program and you're listening right now, I'd love to hear what you've learned about kind of subscription program pricing and how students, how and whether students make choices differently in that environment. All right, I think just a couple more that we want to raise, and then we'll turn to discussion. So another point on discipline. So when we asked folks what discipline, or what's the discipline or content area of your program, the top fields for undergraduate were nursing and health professions, computer and information science, and business administration. Of course, those are also the most common bachelor's or fields in which bachelor's credentials are awarded nationally. So in some ways, that's not surprising. We would see the same in traditional programs. So it might be just a case of there's volume and demand in those areas, so it makes sense. There's also potentially some influence of external standards set for some of those where CBE may or may be easier to do. But we also asked, of course, we had an other field, and we looked through that, of course, and saw that some of the examples appear to be the kinds of programs that would have launched probably in the last handful of years. Cybersecurity sorts of things, which has been huge, grown quite a bit in the last few years. Unmanned aerial vehicles, I think, or whatever the other word for drone is. So we don't know this, of course, but it made us wonder whether there's also some kind of underlying trend where folks, as they think about building a brand new program, they think about, oh, let's build, we have to build a new program anyway, let's build it in a CBE format, rather than let's transition an existing program, which requires a lot of change management. So something we will, again, we're not sure there, but we will continue to monitor into the future. And then next, if anyone in our 30% who doesn't have CBE wonders, if one of your questions is, could CBE work at my institution type? Our broad takeaway, this is not to say that CBE will work at every institution. We don't, of course, know that. But we see examples of CBE at every type of institution we could think of. So the chart you see is all major sectors, so public 4-year, private nonprofit 4-year, private for-profit 4-year, public 2-year, and others. So at all the major sectors, we see CBE programs. So this is of CBE programs. Where are they located? We saw examples. There was at least an example of CBE at every type of Carnegie classification. We could look at different levels of urbanicity, so rural. There's so many urbanicity categories, but very urban to very rural institutions, someone had CBE, and even minority serving institution types, so Hispanic serving institutions and HBCUs. So just food for thought. Again, I'm not trying to claim there that CBE would work at every institution, but in terms of institution type, that's something to think about. So I've been breezing through, in part because I want to leave time for questions. So if you've been sitting on a question, please do submit it now. We want to leave plenty of time for discussion. Well, I should say questions or ideas, reactions, hypotheses and things you wish we would look at next year. We'd love to hear it from you. I do see a couple some questions. So I'm going to click through these really quickly. So can you address the information about the education department ending the CBE experiments? It's a great question. So just a bit of background, the Department of Education was running an experimental site under their experimental sites initiative, where they allowed, I think this was the hybrid disbursement one. Essentially, it waived some specific regulations that would make it easier for institutions to disperse federal financial aid in a CBE or CBE format. So they did end, or they're ending that experiment, I think, very soon. I know a number of institutions, I don't know exactly how many, but a number of institutions were participating in that. They, were able to be federally eligible for federal financial aid, Title IV, through that authority. So they're ending it soon. I don't know all of the details here. I think I'd recommend that you follow up with Charla Long at CBEN. But I think they did that. They have said, the department, that they did that not because they didn't support CBE. In fact, they are very, they seem very supportive of CBE and kind of innovation more generally. They did that, or their logic, stated logic, is more so about because they think that another very bureaucratic thing, the negotiated rulemaking process that they just went through, addressed many of the open issues. So if you're interested in that, I'd recommend, I believe they have now posted the regulation for comment and feedback. Carlos, I wonder if we can find a way to share with this group the link to the notice of proposed rulemaking, in case anyone was very interested in that experiment or even participating and hasn't yet heard of that and wants to add a comment.
Sure, I think we can send it after the presentation because several people have requested the presentation. We can send it along with your presentation.
Yep, that sounds great. Thank you. Okay, that was a super long answer. I'm sorry, but thank you for whoever asked that question. Let's see here. Is there a way to learn which institutions are following a course-based versus the non-direct assessment model of CBE? That's a great question, and I was just looking at the statistic the other day. So we asked, are your programs eligible for federal financial aid? And then followed up with, is that, do you do direct assessment and have that approval, or do you do something else, which typically, or course-based and then something else? The vast majority said course-based. It was something like, I think it was around 70%, but please don't quote me on that one. I'm going to regret that in the recording. So the majority of folks are doing course-based at this time. There may be a variety of reasons for that. It might be easier, I'm not sure. We do not, unfortunately, we don't publish a list of institutions who said they're doing CBE from this survey, in part because we promise that we will not share their information as part of their agreement in participating in the survey. However, I would say that Carlos, you probably have, by CBE, has probably a great list of those institutions that are using course-based in Texas, and CBEN would be able to help with a more national perspective on what institutions are doing course-based.
And let me add here, Kelly, I think at the end of the day, your accreditor and then financial aid take a big role in this. So when we put our SACS perspectives together, we needed to show the mapping of competency map it back to the credit hour, right? So our competencies are mapped back to 120 credit hours to get tax approval, and then of course for financial aid as well. So Jeremy, if you can email me, and I can give you a list of institutions in Texas. But that is correct. For the most part, we are all course-based.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. The next question in here is, I'd be interested in a breakdown between public and private institutions overall. So good question. So at the beginning, I said of our respondents, about 30% were 2 years. Public and private. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, or getting behind myself maybe. If you are referring to, so I would point you to, I don't like to be that person saying, if you look at our report, but since it's posted in the handouts, if you click that second link in the handouts, I think what you're looking for might be on page 22 and 23, and I promise they're designed, it's not very, hopefully, in too much text, but 22 and 23 show a little bit more about types of institutions. So we show the distribution of institution type of institutions with the CBE program, which is what we showed a minute ago. And then we also show of public 2 years, of public 4 years, how many, or what share had said they were doing CBE. And we also show interest versus not interested in that. So hopefully that helps.
So Kelly, I'm gonna put you on the spot. This is a great piece for us to obviously share with our leadership teams, particularly if they're interested in developing CBE programs, right? For those of us that are, wanting to share this information, but maybe even breaking it down a little bit at the state level, for example, is that something that you guys will eventually be working on, trying to filter it out by state so we can use as a resource with our leadership teams?
That's a great question. And if you're talking about Texas, you might be in particular luck because Amardeep Kalon at Austin Community College, I think, actually was a partner of ours last year and did use the Texas data to, I think she might, I don't know if she released her report. I know she's close. So she has a Texas specific report that she's been working on. So if you're referring to Texas, it may be your lucky day because she may have what you're looking for. So how about I promise to follow up with Amardeep and see if that's out. And if we find that it is, we can email it to anybody who is on this webinar.
Perfect. I know that would help a lot of our attendees, just having this information and being state specific. I see a lot of value in that.
Yep. Excellent. Okay. Great. I see another question. Do you have information on how institutions manage time requirements? Time is not fixed, but of course there are limits. How do different institutions manage this? That is a great question. We do not quite get that granular in this survey. We ask whether you can advance upon mastery, but we don't get into what's the kind of minimum progress that has to be made. That's not something we figured we could ask in this kind of already long survey. It's a great question. Carlos, I wonder if you want to say anything from your perspective.
Sure. So I mean, everyone has their different flavors of CBE, right? But in our case, we have a subscription model. Okay, so the student pays $750 for 7 weeks, and during that time, they could take 2 courses or 8 courses. It just depends on their level of competencies, right? So our students come into the program and they begin with 2 courses, right, for financial aid requirements. And let's say they have 20 years of experience. Well, they come in and they have it in financial management, and they come into a course and they take a pretest. If they know 40, 50% of the material, then the faculty guides the learning. So then they only focus on those competencies they need to build up before they take the post-assessment. At the post-assessment level, they need an 80% or better to move on to the next course. So the idea here is that students can leverage their knowledge, skill, competencies to accelerate in courses where they already had those competencies, or take more time in something like art appreciation, right, that they might not have those competencies. So basically, they have to finish the coursework within that 7-week time frame in our model. There are models that are 6 months, right? Ours is 7 weeks. There's 5 weeks. So it just depends what would be a good fit for your institution. So you can follow up with me, and I can share just different models. But for the most part, subscription-based has worked well for our students because they are saving roughly half the cost that they would incur in our traditional paper credit hour format. So hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Thanks, Carlos. All right, I'm looking through the questions. I see that Kip Mead shared the link to the NPRM Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So I hope that link, I responded to it, and hopefully that means it's public to everyone who saw it. But if not, Courtney, could you help us out and make sure that link is public to folks? Let's see here. Okay, I don't remember the barrier slide, but the ability to create assessments to measure competencies, is that one of the major barriers? Technical expertise and cost. That's a good question. We didn't specifically ask about creating assessments, but I think that might live, especially your note about cost, might live under program startup costs, right? Because assessment building is often, there's certainly a chunk of that happens on the front end of the program. So I think some of the cost components are built into the overall program startup cost, and that was certainly one of the top barriers that we saw. It was in fact the top barrier for those who had adopted or were in the process of adopting CBE or had adopted. Its program startup cost was the most commonly reported barrier. So I think the cost component is captured there. I think the technical expertise, asking about whether the technical expertise for assessments, again, we didn't specifically ask that, but I would venture that at least some of the folks read that as part of the on-campus expertise for developing CBE programs. I'm guessing that kind of the knowledge around and kind of the expertise around assessment design, psychometricians, et cetera, would probably be baked into on-campus expertise for developing CBE programs, being, again, a relatively more commonly cited barrier. So I know that wasn't a direct answer to your question about assessments in particular, but I think it's kind of tangentially related to some of the other components that we listed. All right, more questions. I think this one actually is a question for the group, so I will read this question, but ask that folks chime in. And I think you have to use the question box to do that, but so please, it's okay to insert an answer into the question box. So the question is, we're concerned about the muddying of the waters between course-based and direct assessment. Anyone else sensing this? So I think that's a good question for others. If you, muddying of the waters between course-based and direct assessment CBE programs. So please feel free to chime in if you either agree with that or have more information to share, etc. I'll let folks enter there. I do think I'll come back to that if I see answers. Another question, I think you must have said this. Do you have a sense of how many institutions are dealing with undergraduate, quote unquote, traditional learners, Gen Z and younger millennials, versus non-traditional learners, second career, typically older? So great question. So that is, I think the best answer to that is under the student populations in CBE programs. And in general, CBE populations were more likely to be older, so adults over 25. That doesn't directly follow your generation listing there, but in terms of the 25 plus threshold, CBE students were more likely to be above that. However,
and
CBE programs are more likely to. Go ahead.
Well, and I can share a little bit here. So the idea, we're a traditional institution, A&M Commons, right? Over 100 years, our face-to-face on the ground has been more that traditional 18 to 24-year-old. So we saw CBE as an opportunity to find that niche market of adult learners, right? 25 and plus. They just need that flexibility, right? That affordability. They can't come to a class at 8 a.m., right? They have jobs, they have families to support. So we saw CBE as an opportunity for us to enter that market that we weren't particularly serving well. So the average age in our program, CBE, right, not our traditional program, is 38, which is much different than your traditional student that's coming to campus, which we feel is that 18 to 24, it should be on the campus, building relationships, networking. Our CBE programs, for the most part, are trying that adult learners trying to get that degree so they can move up in their careers or change jobs and needs that flexibility that CBE can afford.
Yep. Thanks, Carlos. And I would say, just anecdotally, I think that's what we hear, when we share this with other folks. I think that's generally what we hear. Let's see here. Oh, someone responded to the question about muddying the waters between course-based and direct assessment. Someone said, worked at a traditional and now at a CBE-only institution. From perspective, I think the CBE and traditional can coexist without getting the water too muddied. It's just a different mode of delivery. I think that's a fair statement. And certainly, let's see here, I'll go back up. But Christy, I think you were the one who originally asked the question. I'd be interested in if you're asking muddying of the waters in terms of, to students or to your leaders, your institution leaders, or to someone else. Because I think the comment here is fair, it's just a different mode of delivery. They can coexist, but depending on the audience, it might take lots of communication about distinguishing the two. To leaders with more clarification, from the Department of Ed. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, the Department of Ed. Yes, their understanding. So the Department of Ed, in some ways, we actually shared our survey with folks there and on the Hill the first year, and it was a good reminder to me that they don't know as much about course-based, right? To them, it sort of rises to, or to some of them, I should say, it rises to the level of CBE when it comes to them for direct assessment approval. So it is a good reminder that when folks say CBE in the world, they don't necessarily mean direct assessment, but the Department of Ed might hear direct assessment. So a very good point and good reminder, even as we communicate about that. Okay, Carlos, I've been trying to keep track of all the questions. I think we've now addressed all the questions that came in, or at least
yes, I
answered them fully, but try. So everyone, please feel free to continue entering questions. We are glad to stay on the line. Jessica, would you put up the next slide, though, just so we make sure that folks see this? So we imagined, actually, that we would be doing this while our 2020 survey was live, and that we could, at the end, say, please make sure that your institution responds to this survey. Of course, that is not how the world played out for us. So we have paused on that because we didn't think it was fair or smart to send a survey out to institutions right now, given all the transitions happening on campus. So all that said, though, we do believe that it's still important to keep tracking the field as it evolves. So we will be sharing the survey, or please stay tuned this fall when we plan to share the survey. We are really interested in how and whether the transitions in the state of the world and the anticipated types of students enrolling in the fall have affected perceptions of, or maybe adoption of, but perceptions of competency-based education. So please stay tuned for this fall. I still don't see any new questions. So we'll just put up this slide and say thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your good engagement with the questions. We really, really appreciate it. It's fun to see sort of what's on folks' minds and get good feedback about what we should think about and consider next year. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you tremendously to ICBE and Carlos for hosting. Thank you, Carlos and Courtney, for hosting this and making this whole thing possible. We've got some links here and just our contact information if you'd like to get in touch with us. Please feel free to do any of that, although we will, of course, share the things that we promised to share live on the webinar. We'll make sure that gets to you. So we'll stay on the line. Oh, go ahead, Carlos.
No, I was just gonna say, I just want to thank you and Jessica for the great presentation. To our audience for taking the time and for the engagement. I thought that was great, making it more into a conversation. If you do have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You will see that the CBE community likes to engage and likes to assist others in their track to building their programs. So please reach out to us. And you also have Kelly's and Jessica's information. And I just want to remind everyone that we do have the final webinar of the spring webinar series on May 28th at 2 p.m. We're going to have Kevin Peak from South Texas College. He's going to be showing his work on the CBE handbook, which will be a resource for the state of Texas. So stay tuned for that one and hope you can join us. Kelly, Jessica, thank you again for your time, and to our audience. We'll stick around in case you have any additional questions, but thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you, and we hope you all and your campus communities are doing well.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, I see another question, Carlos. How exciting. Okay, we're finding a lot of CBE resources are geared exclusively for non-traditional and online-only learners. We're an undergraduate CBE institution working mostly with Gen Z ages.
Interesting.
I wonder if there's more of a question coming, but it's a good question.
So I will say, I am seeing a trend, particularly in states up north, that a lot of high schools are going CBE and are being very focused on those competencies. So I think we're going to start seeing a trend in which students are going to start wanting to go to CBE-only institutions. But I do think at the high school level, there's a lot of work happening more in the northern states. So we could find some resources for you. But here in Texas, we're seeing more work being done for that non-traditional student simply because of our state plan, right? The 60 by 30 TX, where there's a large focus placed on 25 to 34-year-olds that might have some college credit, but no degree to show for their work, right? So they haven't seen that ROI from higher education. And so we need 60% of the population to have some degree so they can fill workforce demand. So I think that's why you're seeing that push for that non-traditional learner in Texas and other states. But I do agree with you that we might be seeing a shift where CBE might fit with those younger students that want to, for example, be focused on coding, right, and go directly into a CBE degree. I expect we'll see those grow more and more in years to come. Kelly, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yep. No, I think that's right. And he clarified he's writing from Canada. Oh my goodness, welcome. Welcome to the virtual world. Wonderful. So Competency works as a resource for K-12. So that's a good point. I wonder, Carlos, I wonder if we share this question with Charlotte, because I know there are other, both there are a couple Canadian members, and she might have a good sense of, whether there are other institutions that also have developed a lot of resources for those working with that kind of straight from high school age group. So
this might be a good question for Kelly. This might be a good question for our competency-based listserv that we're on with Lumina Foundation. See if anyone pops up as well.
Yep, that's a great point. Okay, well, we will follow up with you. I've written your name down. We will follow up with you, Jeremy. Okay, let's see. Oh, another question. What role has industry played in developing CBE courses or programs? What role should they play? That's a great question. I don't think that this, this survey sort of broadly asks, have you worked with employers, but doesn't get into the nitty-gritty details of making that work. But I do think Carlos, there might be Texas-specific resources that you want to highlight as well. But CBEN, Competency-Based Education Network, I think last fall maybe released a guide to employer partnerships maybe, or something to that effect. I'm going to see if I can Google it really quickly, because I think there's
yes. And so
some good
our so let's share that resource, because that is an excellent resource from CBEN, the Competency-Based Education Network. But from our experience, I can tell you both our programs were built in partnership with industry, with our employers in our service areas, and they continue to be part of our advisory board. So in our organizational leadership competency-based program, we have employers such as L3 Communications, from financial management offices. And then for our criminal justice competency-based programs, we have everything from actual police officers, because there is a focus on law enforcement leadership. We have judges in the board. We have captains. And so we are working closely with industry to make sure the competencies align with the expectations for our students as they enter the workforce. So we believe it is very, very important to work with industry for these programs.
Absolutely, yes. I did just insert a link into the chat box to both their CBEN's Employer Engagement Best Practices Toolkit, which I think has some examples embedded in it, as well as, what is this one called? Creating CBE Pathways, Insights from CBEN's Employer Engagement Collaboratory. So that may not be kind of a universal response, but it has a bit of a toolkit and probably some examples that might be helpful.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay, we're running on time. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Please feel free to email us, reach out to us, and we're more than glad to help as you work towards building a program on your own campus. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kelly and Jessica and Courtney.
Thank you, Carlos. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.